From training to performing, join our big league conversation. Welcome to the CSP Elite Baseball Development Podcast with your host, Eric Cressey.
Welcome back to the CSP Elite Baseball Development Podcast. I'm your host, Eric Cressey, and this is episode 84. We'll be back soon with some episodes to kick off 2021. But before we do, today's episode includes our top episodes of 2020. So it's a compilation pulled together by podcast editor extraordinaire Dakota Herman. Lots of really good stuff in here from the past year. I think you'll really like it. And again, we'll be back soon with some new content for you here in the new year. This episode is brought to you by Athletic Greens, the most comprehensive NSF certified for sport daily nutritional supplement I've ever tried. With so many stressors in life, it's difficult to maintain effective nutritional habits and give our bodies the nutrients they need to thrive. As a father of 3 young kids and a co-founder of multiple businesses in multiple states, on top of still being an avid exerciser, I know that busy schedules can really take their toll on us. Whether it's poor sleep, exercise or life stressors, environmental factors, or simply not eating enough of the right foods, we can wind up deficient nutritionally. This is where Athletic Greens can really help. It's a game-changing nutritional insurance policy. They simplify the logistics of getting optimal nutrition on a daily basis by giving you just one thing with all the best things. And that's why I use it daily and recommend it to our athletes. 1 scoop of Athletic Greens contains 75 vitamins, minerals, and whole food sourced ingredients, including a multivitamin, multimineral, probiotic, green superfood blend, and more. They work together to fill the nutritional gaps in your diet, increase energy and focus, aid in digestion, recovery, and supporting of a healthy immune system. This all can happen without taking multiple products. While most nutritional products come to market and stay stagnant, Athletic Greens continues to obsessively improve this one holistic formula based on the latest research, producing 53 improvements over the last decade. They invest in the most absorbable and natural source of each ingredient and go above and beyond in third-party testing to ensure their customers continue to receive the highest quality and best daily nutritional habit on the planet. It's lifestyle friendly, whether you're keto, paleo, vegan, dairy-free, or gluten-free, and contains less than 1 gram of sugar without compromising on taste. They put 75 ingredients through the NSF for Sport certification to come up with a formula that's trusted by some of the world's best athletes, including our own. Right now, Athletic Greens is giving our listeners 10 free travel packets with their subscription. Simply go to athleticgreens.com/Cressey to receive my offer. These travel packs are perfect for supporting your immune system, energy, and gut health when you're traveling for games, training, or simply when you're on the go. They can be a great counterbalance to less than ideal on-the-road food options. So if you want to bridge the gap between deficient and optimal and give yourself the best chance to get nutrient diversity, then head to athleticgreens.com/Cressey and get your 10 free travel packets today. Again, that's athleticgreens.com/Cressey, CRESSEY.
Thanks again for joining us for the special edition of the CSP Elite Baseball Development Podcast. As I mentioned earlier, we'll be counting down our top episodes of 2020. So without further ado, at number 10, we have episode 46, our February Q&A. In this episode, Eric talks pitch counts, vertical pulling with athletes who have a history of lat injury, exercises for strengthening the deceleration muscles of the throwing motion, and what to assess when personalizing an arm care program.
Deceleration does not just happen at ball release. We talked earlier in this episode about lat injuries, right? Your lat has to work eccentrically during layback. That's deceleration. It's accepting force. And then there's obviously an amortization phase where, basically it turns it around. It uses that elastic energy to potentiate late arm speed. What a lot of people don't know is the long head of your triceps is acting eccentrically to prevent excessive elbow flexion during the layback position. There's a hot take for you. Think about it this way. You see a lot of gross triceps in throwers, right? And it's probably because it's so important as a decelerator at the layback phase of throwing. So what we need to do is we need to get away from this mindset that muscles only accelerate or decelerate or stabilize. Basically, they're doing a little bit of all of those things throughout the course of our delivery. For me, I always come back to good movement is good movement.
At number 9, we have episode 68, From Negative to Neutral with Trevor Moawad. In this episode, Trevor talks the current shortcomings of sports psychology, why unconditional positivity is not the answer, the true impact of negativity, and about influence and how we can more profoundly impact those we mentor.
What we found out unequivocally was that negativity worked negatively, somewhere between 83 and 100% of the time, from the Mayo Clinic, Harvard, Georgetown. There's nobody that can deny that. And that all the information around being positive or meditating or being mindful or all those things was anecdotal, particularly positive thinking. So as we started to study that, and Coach Saban really kind of commissioned me to do more, I found out that negativity is carried most powerfully by language, not inner thoughts, but outer language. And when you say something out loud, good or bad, it's 10 times more powerful than when you think it. And if it's negative, it's a multiple of 4 to 7 times more powerful. So when I say negative things out loud, I increase their probability by 40 to 70 times that they'll happen. The broader goal, I know for Russell and myself, our business Limitless Minds, is how can we demystify thinking? Mm-hmm. And fuck sports for making it all about meditating and breathing. It's so disappointing, and it frustrates me because I'm not a big presence in that world, and I get the value of it, but we need to start with not saying stupid things. We need to start with not watching or hanging out with people that we can avoid. We need to start with not putting ourselves where we're listening to the wrong people and we're giving pain too much of a voice. We need to get that stuff right. And when we get that stuff right, then we can evolve to breathing, and we can evolve to changing from the inside out and meditating and imprinting. All of those things have a place, but let's do simple better first.
Next up, we have number 8, episode 47 with Tim Collins. In this episode, Tim discussed his journey to becoming a big leaguer, specifically transforming from a 5'5", 130-pound guy into a big leaguer in just 2 years. He also discusses developing a changeup in Double-A and talks about a few of his setbacks in his professional career.
What takes a 5'5", 130-pound guy into a big leaguer in 2 years?
I think just a lot of dedication to the training. I think the biggest thing for me was, maturing, and a good nutrition and a good strength training program is really what helped me turn the corner as far as developing into the pitcher that I became. I certainly needed the velocity. I needed the weight. I needed the strength that came along with that. So really it was just kind of focusing on the meat and potatoes and just building a good foundation and putting on good weight and getting strong.
In at number 7, we have episode 76, Performance Principles and Progressions with Kelly Sterett. In episode 76, Kelly talks becoming a savage generalist, connecting inputs and outputs for clients, the language of strength and conditioning, the power of walking for systemic health, and lessons for success in the fitness industry.
One of the things that happens is that most of us come out of a system. We come out of a tradition. Like, these are the movements I do. This is what I learned. This is, and so your heritage really influences your moving. And, one of the things that, as you try to figure out what your system is or how you end up adding things on to your original system. And in software, this is called a kludge, where you end up having a really inelegant thing. Well, we do this for rotation, and we do this for single leg, and all of a sudden you have athletes who are cobbling together and they can't see how the system interacts. You add in some kind of nutrition thing, you can't tell what's happening. You add these environmental loads, and all of a sudden you have a really dirty sort of matrix of information, right? You can't see inputs and outputs. Mm-hmm. So what we try to do is, start with the basics.
Following number 7, in at number 6, we have episode 62, Safer Sprint Training with Derek Hansen. In this episode, CSP Massachusetts Director of Performance John O'Neill interviews Derek Hansen, where they break down maximizing sprint training, coaching sprint technique, rehabilitating hamstring strains, and simplifying coaching philosophy.
And a lot of the time people are a little taken back that it is a sprint-based approach. Even within, say, 48 hours after the injury, I'll be doing drills that are related to running mechanics and basically trying to get them back to doing some sort of acceleration, albeit over short distances, as soon as possible. There's a lot of good things about acceleration that can help sort of retrain the hamstring without putting it at risk. And a lot of it, is dependent on the posture when you accelerate, as opposed to upright sprinting, which can expose the hamstring to more stretch and eccentric load. So we do a very, very progressive sprint-based or acceleration-based approach over, say, 10 yards, 10 meters, 10 yards, which is really only about 6 or 7 strides. From that approach, I found that, if somebody usually takes 3 to 4 weeks to come back from a, relatively significant hamstring strain, sometimes we can narrow that down to like 7 to 10 days.
And now, at number 5, episode 69, Tackling Controversial Throwing Topics with Mike Reinold. In episode 69, Eric and Mike Reinold covered 2 of baseball performance's most debated topics, the sleeper stretch and weighted ball training.
How are you attacking your internal rotation deficits that you do feel like need to be addressed?
So the first thing we do, and this is the big part, is we do a good, thorough evaluation of the person. And we take internal and external rotation. We do it on both sides. We add them up. We look for total rotational motion. And we try to figure out the puzzle just based on those numbers. And I just saw a kid literally 3, 4, 5 days ago. I forget what it was. It was a very classic story. He said, hey, I'm a high school baseball player. My shoulder's been sore. I saw the doctor. He said I had GERD. I went to PT. I'm doing the sleeper stretch. My shoulder's not getting any better. So what do you do? So what we do is we bring him in for an evaluation. We look at his numbers. Every time this happens, we find that they have increased their internal rotation too much.
Yep.
So now their total rotational motion is too high, and it's because of that gain in IR. They've destabilized the shoulder. They've made them something worse. And then I look like an expert clinician by simply telling them to stop.
Yep.
Right? And that's it. It's addition by subtraction, right? So I would say for the majority of baseball players that I work with, I would say I focus on internal rotation at most 10% of the time.
Yep. You know, what's an interesting follow-up to that? Now, like you were at ASMI this January, we were there together, and that was one of the more compelling, I guess proclamations from the biomechanics folks in-house was that you actually don't need all that much internal rotation to throw a baseball.
Right.
You don't need you definitely don't need 90 degrees. So when I hear people raving, like, we got him full internal rotation, it's like, well, what did you tear to get there?
Yeah, exactly. Well, I hate to say it, but we see it all the time. Then the kid gets an MRI, it shows a posterior capsule tear.
Definitely seen it.
So let's think about this now. Like, when are the physicians going to start putting that piece of that puzzle together that we see that you're like, wait a minute, you said it was tight, so they stretched it. Now it's torn. Mm-hmm. Like, that's a big difference between tight and torn. If you're going to push your physiology a little bit, you have to have maxed out all your buckets.
Yeah.
Right. So you have to be super strong. You have to be mature. You have to have good arm strength. You should have good mechanics. And then let's start pushing the physiology. But look, great example again. Last week, talking to an ex-MLB all-star pitcher. So this guy's no scrub, right? His kids are now in high school, right? So I'm dating myself a little bit here. I know all the old guys, but he's literally sending me videos of his kid. And he's like, I've completely limited his volume as a kid because I've been saving it. So that's great. And he's like, but like, look, we're struggling to get past low 80s. And he's like thinking about doing like a weighted ball program, that type of thing. And he sends me a video. The kid has no drive, right? So no linear like drive, no rotational power, no hip shoulder separation, right? Mm-hmm. Why on earth would we give him a weighted ball when he hasn't maximized any of his other buckets?
It's good to recap, right? So don't sleeper stretch. There are better ways to get the job done that don't provoke things as much. Weighted balls work. They probably don't work quite as well as we thought they do. And we need to make sure that they're used in the right populations, in the right doses, at the right times. We know that acquiring external rotation quickly is probably a recipe for shoulder, elbow, or a host of other issues that, are emerging. Strength matters a ton, even when we don't know that range of motion matters. Having a strong shoulder joint, particularly the rotator cuff musculature, is huge.
All right. One last thing I wanted to add. I know we're running out of time.
No,
one last thing. New study was just published this year that showed that 87% of the force that contributes to your velocity on your fastball comes from your legs and your transfer through your core. It's not your arm. And we know that. We cannot focus on the 13% if we're trying to increase velocity.
And at number 4, we have another interview led by CSP Massachusetts Director of Performance John O'Neill. Episode 54, Speed Training in Baseball with Lee Taft. In episode 54, Lee covers his 7 movement patterns for speed, the crossover step versus the lateral run step, how to optimize your setup as a base stealer and defensive player, and how the industry as a whole can be better at training speed from the youth to professional levels.
A lateral run step is very similar to a base stealer, so how they take off. Speaking on the lateral run step, can you elaborate on, 1, how you teach that, and 2, why it's important to do it that way versus a traditional crossover step?
Let's just look at base stealing for a second, because that's the easiest to identify with. If I have somebody taking a lead and getting in a pretty good steal stance or an athletic stance, I'm going to turn to their right to go towards second base. What happens is I have to abide by laws of human movement. So for me to begin changing inertia, which is our first law, I have to be able to push my mass in the direction I want to go. So if I use my left leg and I give a quick push, almost like a quick nudge, that starts moving my center of mass or my belly button towards second base. That gives me a split second to reposition that front foot. And now that front foot becomes just like me coming out of the blocks if I'm a 100-meter sprinter. It's positioned to drive down and back. It's positioned so I can recruit good hamstring and glutes, my hips, and I can really push strong. And then that back leg now comes from being towards first base and immediately gets driven towards second. But the difference is we could say it's crossing over the midline of the body, but really what's happening, because that front foot is opened up, it's no longer crossing over that step. It's just running in a normal gait pattern like we would if we were to run, accelerate, or sprint. So the lateral run basically means we allow the backside to push, we allow the front side to open, and then we allow the front side to push. So I call it pop. When I say to my athletes, hey, let's make sure give me some good pop. That just means I want them to push, open, push. I want them to push, move their body to the right, open that front foot, and then push with that front foot down and back, and then the back leg comes through. I'm not here to change what's comfortable for you. I'm here to give you reasons why our brain and our body can be more efficient doing things a particular way. You can break the rules if you know the rules, but if you don't know the rules and you don't know the effect, you're probably going to suffer the consequences of not knowing those rules. So the arms are a perfect example. When my elbows are bent and my hands are positioned in front of my belt, so I'm in a good steel stance, my hands are bent, they're right about my belt level. I have a fast lever there. I can move from my shoulders pretty quick. I can clear that right arm and I can throw that left arm down towards second base. And that's kind of like turning the keys. Now, I see a lot of players who like to drop that right arm long. Some like to open the right arm and drop the left arm long. So they think that it opens them up and gives them a better chance. And I'll always say to them, I'm saying that's fine as long as you understand what you're taking away from the stance. So if we talk about younger athletes, first of all, I'm just real big on let's develop a really good athlete. Let's develop somebody that has the ability to perform what I like to call the 7 movement patterns of speed. So that would be the ability to accelerate straight ahead, and then the ability to sprint, the ability to shuffle laterally, the ability to laterally run, or some people might call that a crossover, but laterally run. And then we might have to have the ability to backpedal and then hip turn to be able to retreat and then be able to jump vertically. And now if we get a young athlete that can do those 7 patterns really well, what we find is the sport itself and playing the sport and being taught the various positions of the sport, that brings out the kind of like the specific movements or almost like the identity of how a baseball player moves.
All right, home stretch here, people. At number 3, we have episode 50, Helping Hitters to Higher Ground with Doug Lada. In episode 50, Doug explains why hitters should swing to hit the ball in the air, the trinity of hitting, balance, vision, and timing, adjustability, and why it's so important to get to 50-50, the non-negotiables for elite hitters, and how coaches can better prepare their athletes for success in the box.
So you were one of the first guys to really promote hitting the ball in the air. You were front and center on that as it took a more prominent role in the game today. Talk about the resistance that you got, from the swing down traditionalist, early on as you introduced that.
Well, most certainly at the major league level, 8-9 years ago, there was a lot of resistance to, the idea of getting the ball in the air. And we describe it as a very, simple idea. We don't want any ball coming off the bat at a downward angle. Mm-hmm. At higher levels of the game, when you hit a ground ball, the chances are you're going to be out. It's just the way, defense is played. I've asked, infielders, what happens when a ground ball is hit to you? And they go, the result is an out. Exactly. So our thought has always been, get the ball in the air, shoot the grass. We're not necessarily trying to create a swing that's going to hit a ball 400 feet over the fence. But we want to create a swing dynamic that allows us to exploit the game, and that's in the air. You've got to hit it over defenders, not at them. And of course, some of those balls are going to be, in the gaps, doubles, as well as balls leaving the park, but that's not the goal. And I think now, years later, I guess the pendulum shift has allowed people to try and look into the thought of get the ball in the air with a lot more acceptance. Mm-hmm. But I will assure you, even 20 years ago, at roughly the amateur and college level, it was ridiculed. Little league coaches would ridicule the idea of what we were teaching players. High school coaches would grimace and shake their head and, talk about heresy. And it just continued to go up the ladder from there.
What are some of the biggest misconceptions about it? Because as with any, new thought process that gets put out, it's kind of like the game of telephone where, you tell one person, they tell somebody, and by the time it's 15 coaches away, the message is really, really skewed in a direction that you probably, wouldn't accept from a quality control standpoint in your own facility. So where do people misconstrue what you're putting out there?
Well, the distortion is real. And it started when we told a writer, I think it was Marlon Bird and I were being interviewed, and we talked about our idea of just trying to get the ball in the air, shoot the grass, just not, hit down on the ball to create, balls that are going to be out. And that writer coined the phrase fly ball revolution because it sounds better than get the ball in the air.
Yeah.
And the thought of, that, you suddenly saw people changing swings and actually shoulder angles up to the sky, trying to hit, underneath the ball and doing all these things that people began to equate with, quote unquote, launch angle swings. And this was part of some of the problems we had with the major league level in the first couple of years, because people would sit there and say, this is a launch angle swing. They'd post it on social media. So, a big league hitting coach would look at that swing and know that was a terrible swing. Mm-hmm. But then they would sit there and say, oh, that launch angle stuff, that's that Lada stuff. Oh, I'm out on that. Because of the perception of what they saw and what was being presented by by someone else's interpretation of what we were trying to do. So again, the biggest thing we're trying to do is we're teaching a body efficient and effective swing, basically, an economy of motion, because we don't have time at the rate of what we do at the big league level. We're working on milliseconds. So we try to clean up the body moves so we can have a swing that can exploit the entire zone. We want to be able to have coverage and effective contact, in a long area rather than, up and out of the zone as a lot of people portray the quote unquote launch angle swing to be. We call it basically the trinity, balance, vision, and timing. They're all tied together. And even though we can see balance and we can kind of feel timing, vision becomes a different part, but they're all tied together because if we're moving in balance, we basically are on time. We're not wasting time compensating for bad moves. Because the key is getting down in a good position to hit. And then the whole idea of vision, when we're balanced, and again, to the nth degree, we see better. So it's not only that vision I talked about when you're moving from setup to 50-50. It's also the fact if I maintain really stable head, I'm going to have earlier pitch recognition. And it's a game changer. So we have our setup, some people call it the stance, and then we have that move to our 50-50, and that's where we're going to start to swing. So again, the 50-50 represents, balance, but the key is, in order to get to a good balance 50-50, the hitter's body has to be set up in a way that allows their body to move to get to that 50-50 fairly consistently. From a setup to 50-50, we're now moving, and we have to maintain balance before that front foot comes down. Otherwise, the way we come down will compromise our ability to actually swing. For instance, when a hitter comes down very heavy on their front foot, they're going to have a front side swing, which in our thinking, the ideal is we want a backside driven swing. We want to control it from the backside, and we want to deliver the backside. So essentially our entire posterior chain is through the ball, rather than being cut off by a front side spinning off the backside.
We're closing the gap on number 1, but let's not rush to the finish line too quickly. We have a great episode at number 2, episode 44, Mobility Methods with Dana Santis. In episode 44, Dana discusses why she left corporate real estate to pursue her passion for yoga, how she marketed herself to bring mobility techniques to professional sports, how her movement philosophy has evolved since first entering the field, and how individuals can optimize their mobility work.
Some of the common mistakes I see is, so yoga is typically done in a yoga studio. And as soon as you think about a yoga studio, it conjures an image of, the, pristine wood floors and the quiet with the soft music and the gong thing, whatever, there's probably a name for that. And, like bells and singing bowls and eye pillows. And when people come into professional sports and they try to recreate an environment like that, or they expect that they're going to have an environment like that, they're going to be really disappointed, very disappointed. I mean, my first session with Terry Francona at the Red Sox, we were in the training room, and hopefully they've updated some of the stuff in Fenway because it was the size of a closet, and we were on the floor working on some they weren't walking around us, Eric. They were stepping over us. There were people and this was my first real session with someone in professional sports. And yeah, that was illuminating for sure. And then there have been times that I've been, out with the Pirates, early on in my career too, and I learned a lot of lessons from this, but we would be out in the batting cages that have a tin roof. And I've got 120, no lie, it would be FIL. They would throw everybody from FIL out into the batting cages. Now, I did bring an assistant with me, but it was still 120 guys, and at least, 50 of them didn't speak English. And now it's pouring rain on a tin roof.
Oh my goodness.
You know how, yes, I would leave Bradenton, and I couldn't talk for 3 days because I had to yell the whole time and I'd completely lose my voice. So yeah, you coming in and expecting that you're going to recreate a yoga environment in any way, shape, or form in pro sports is just, you've got to let that go. And I think that is a common mistake, because then, you expect that you'll have a special room. I mean, I'm in hallways, I'm in the corners of weight rooms where the music is so loud, your chest is rattling. It's like you're at a concert. So yeah, there's that. But then but then it's also like having a set plan, because that's another thing. They teach you this in yoga teacher training. You draw out all of the poses you're going to do in your class. And I think it's wrong even with the general population, probably even more so with the general population, that they do this, because you've got a group of all different bodies with all different injury histories, and you don't know what those are. And you're setting up a class. You don't know who's going to show up in your class, and you're setting up a class with all of these poses that you're picking arbitrarily. And for an hour, you've got the set amount of time. There are no set amounts of time in professional sports, right? You come in and they say, yeah, we've given you this hour block, and then you show up and, oh, well, we've got 3 meetings plus we're running late. So you've got 20 minutes. So what would the person who had written out all of their poses that they're going to do for 60 minutes, now what are you going to do in 20 minutes so that you add value? So I don't ever plan, write out some plan of what I'm going to do. I have to see who shows up, not just who shows up, but what's the energy in that room? What did they do before they showed up? Like, were they just out running sprints because they got in trouble? Because that can happen, right? And then they had to run a sprint, especially with the younger guys. I'm not talking about the major leaguer. Well, sometimes. But like, what is the attitude in the room? It's really so much more about context. But then there are so many traditional yoga poses. I know that Bikram is super popular still, even with that documentary out. And I think it's popular with athletes because it feels difficult to do. But just because something feels difficult to do does not mean that it's good for you. And when it's true Bikram yoga, it's hot yoga, that it's 105 degrees. By the way, if you stand and I've taught Bikram before, only because I was doing a favor for someone, not because I like it. And but if you stand in that room and don't move in 105 degrees, you're going to sweat bullets, it's not, and you're going to feel like you're doing something. So you have to recognize that 105 degrees is going to have that effect on you, whether you're moving or not. But now there's 26 arbitrary poses that this little absolute jerk of a man, like an egomaniac, came up with, who he doesn't seem to have any training in biomechanics. I mean, he was raised doing yoga, and there are at least 3 of them that I just don't even think human beings should do. There's one, it's like called rabbit, and you put it's extreme flexion of your cervical spine, and then you're putting your body weight on it. Why?
No.
Yeah, right?
Yeah.
No. So I mean, there are so many mistakes that are made, but I think it's really trying to make traditional yoga fit sports or vice versa. It's actually when you're trying to make the sports environment fit traditional yoga, that doesn't work. So, and there isn't to say that there isn't value in yoga poses, but if you look at any mobility type of work, any styles of corrective exercises, any kind of mobility, you can find a basis in yoga poses, right? Like you can say, oh, that looks very much like this. And there's a very good chance that these movements did originate from a yoga pose, but then they became movements as opposed to poses. And I think the also coming out of and into the position is just as important, if not more, than the position itself. And in a lot of traditional yoga, it's a static posture, and it's about holding the posture. And then if it isn't the static type of posture, then it's a flowing, series of poses, but then it becomes about the flow and less about, are you executing each exercise effectively? And I think that was my big issue with yoga, is if I try to take any of those traditional styles and make them work, when you're flowing through positions, you can be compensating and missing parts of the exercise. If you're just holding a static pose does not necessarily translate to better movement. So I needed to take what worked out of yoga and then make it work better for sports. They teach you this in yoga teacher training. You draw out all of the poses you're going to do in your class. And I think it's wrong even with the general population, probably even more so with the general population, that they do this, because you've got a group of all different bodies with all different injury histories, and you don't know what those are. And you're setting up a class. You don't know who's going to show up in your class, and you're setting up a class with all of these poses that you're picking arbitrarily. And for an hour, you've got the set amount of time. There are no set amounts of time in professional sports, right? You come in and they say, yeah, we've given you this hour block. And then you show up and, oh, well, we've got 3 meetings plus we're running late. So you've got 20 minutes. So what would the person who had written out all of their poses that they're going to do for 60 minutes, now what are you going to do in 20 minutes so that you add value? I think too often what happens is when someone feels nervous about the fact that they don't know enough to really add enough value, instead they fake it. And I hate that fake it till you make it thing. I hate that, right? Because that they come in with kind of a chip on their shoulder, like they have something to prove, because they're afraid that they really don't have anything to prove. Like they don't have anything to offer. And I think that's a huge mistake, because there is so much value into coming in just the way that you've said, where it's like, you know what? I think there's value here, but I'm not going to know how much value I can offer you until we collaborate on this, until you show me what you need, not me coming in, guessing what you need and saying that I can fix it, or coming in and telling you that things are broken and I'm here to fix them. That's the worst approach you can take. But so many people take that approach because they think that they're going to be embraced as the savior.
And now, at number 1, our top episode of 2020, episode 43, Optimizing Rotational Power with Dr. Greg Rose. In episode 43, Dr. Greg Rose discusses his intro to Titleist and co-founding TPI, the expansion of TPI beyond golf into areas such as on-base university, how coaches can better interpret data and visual information, internal versus external cues, and the application of these interventions, and long-term athletic development.
I think too often we look past like the building rapport and asking questions and getting athlete feedback, because you can go overhaul or deliver, but then you realize the guy has 10 degrees of hip internal rotation.
Right.
You're probably, chasing the wrong,
But it's like I said,
situation.
it's even the same thing. Like, I don't think a lot of coaches, like you're asking me, like, should they just look at these 4 snapshots in time and make an opinion? I don't think a coach would have ever asked for those 4 snapshots in time. Those are data guys going, here's 4 things I think it's important for you to look at. You know what I mean? I just think it's asked backwards.
I think not only that, it's one thing to have all that, but it's another thing altogether. And this actually probably leads into my next question, is that to have people that can actually supervise the intervention, whether that's a physical intervention to do some manual therapy or some positional breathing, or, some kind of strength and conditioning intervention, or something more mechanical in nature, whatever that may be from a skill development standpoint.
Well, I'll tell you what I tell all my guys. I believe in this. Listen, I'm come from the medical world. You're coming from the training and medical world. I feel like it should all be coach driven, right? So I always say it's like I use the Formula One analogy. Like the coach is the driver of the car, right? The car is the player, right? The coach is the driver, right? The driver is supposed to read the dashboard and kind of figure out how to drive this car properly, right? And if the car dashboard is got a red light on it, or there's smoke coming out of the tailpipe, the driver pulls the car into the pit crew and says, hey, we got a problem over here. In baseball, it doesn't work like that, right? We have these silos, right? It's like the strength conditioning does one thing and the medical does the other thing. And the coach says, well, that's not even important. And these guys don't even like each other. And it's been a really awkward dynamics that, like you said, if somebody could put all this together, and it's the best teams in the world obviously are doing that, then all this data turns into actionable items that get corrected. right?
Absolutely. And one of the things I think that is good is we have seen a surge, and I give a lot of credit to you, like in terms of how you've shared this at some of your courses. We've seen a surge in research and applied practice on the coaching front. Nick
Yeah,
Winkelman's done some great stuff in this regard.
absolutely.
We're seeing more information about, how random practice can benefit folks more than block practice,
Yep.
how external focus cues can be superior to internal focus cues at times. We've seen a big focus on constraint-based learning,
Yep.
particularly in the baseball world, I feel like. But I think we've also seen this go really, really far in some regards, right?
Yeah.
Where we throw people into random practice scenarios before they have had any chance to develop. It's not like we're training 5-year-olds where, I put my daughter on the playground and they figure it out.
Right.
If you give somebody a 315-pound barbell and you tell them to deadlift it, they're not all magically going to default to perfect technique.
Well, I'll give
So,
you a couple things on this that I think are interesting that people might be messing up. So obviously the research, I had the pleasure to travel the world for 3 years with Dr. Dick Schmidt and Tim Lee, two of the most published motor learning experts in the world. We lost Dr. Schmidt a few years ago. He passed away, but Dr. Lee's still around. And those guys taught me more about how to coach and, like you said, when to apply random and all that kind of stuff. And the one thing that I think is very, very evident on most of the research is both block and random and internal, external, they all work, right? Mm-hmm. So it's always, they're kind of debating which one gets you there faster, right? So exactly. I never want to say anything's negative, right? So it's still better than nothing. Yeah. Then, and then I think one of I think people, from a random versus block training type of practice, one of the things you're going to hear all the time is that if you do random practice, you're actually learning, right? So if you want to build a new, let's say a player has a mechanical fault and you want to change a new fault, random learning is kind of like doing random multiplication to learn multiplication. Block would be like if I said, what's 12 times 11? You said 12 times 11 1,000 times in a row. That doesn't really teach you how to do math. It just teaches you how to remember what 12 times 11 is, right? Mm-hmm. But as soon as somebody gives you another a problem, you don't know how to do it. So we understand random makes you solve the problem and do it all over again, right? But there's some really interesting things that happen with block practice. Now, when you do block practice, like if we just did 12 times 11, like let's say we're going to do free throws on basketball, right? Let's say you and I both suck. And you said, I'm just going to go do 1,000 free throws in a row. And I'm just going to do random shots around the court, right? The research will say in the game, I'll make more free throws than you, right? Just because that's just how it works, is that random tends to work. But the research also says is that if we were just to practice, right? Let's say you practice for an hour just throwing free throws for an hour, and I'm doing random shots for an hour. If we tested us after that hour on just free throws, you would win, right? Because you just did an hour of free throws. Of course, you're going to be better right now. So you can you'll perform better in practice with block practice. It's just you didn't really learn a lot. Like in 2 days later, your retention's not going to be that great. Well, think about this in baseball. If I want you to learn at certain times, but I also want you to perform better at certain times, right? So if we're saying, hey, listen, I want you to learn a new pitch, right? There's a time to do that, but it's probably not right before the game. Right? It's maybe early, let's say one of the days you're not pitching or off season, you're going to try and learn these and we do random. But if it's like the day of the game and we're trying to warm up, well, the research is really clear. If you do block practice, you'll actually perform better that day. Right? So I think a lot of people make this mistake that, most of the learning guys will tell you, like, if I'm going to go play golf and on the driving range right before I play, I'm probably going to do block practice because number one, it makes me confident. I'll perform better that day and I'll do okay. But if I'm going to go practice, not when I'm going to play, and I want to learn something that's new to the repertoire or learn a new way to hit a shot, I should do that random practice, but not right before I go play. So there's a place for both of these, if this makes sense. Block and random are both very applicable depending on when we're doing it and why we're doing it. Right?
Absolutely. That's a great synopsis. I think it's an important one because, I think we do see random practice. I think, maybe random practice with external focus cues. It's an interesting combination that generally works really, really well. But I think we also see scenarios where, it's utilized as a, it's a crutch for lazy coaching, where something looks horrific, it looks dangerous, but hey, they'll figure it out, and,
Yeah, yeah.
and,
Well,
and they're being exposed to new movement patterns.
So I'll tell you, like the motor learning guys were very clear on this. Like, if you're going to do random practice and external cues, they have to be able to at least understand what they're supposed to do and have at least be able to execute the program correctly.
Yeah.
If they don't even know how to do it or they even know what they're supposed to do, they would always do block first.
And I think it has to be a safe environment, I mean,
100%.
where it's totally fine to fail. It's a different thing altogether to, shoot from 18 feet instead of 16 feet, as compared to going out and trying to squat 1,000 pounds when you haven't even squatted 200 or something along those lines. And
Absolutely. I think the moral of the story is the best in the world use a combination of both of these. Do not throw out the baby with the bathwater.
Exactly.
Yeah.
I'll be honest, I use internal focus cues every single day when I teach cuff exercises, scapular control stuff. There's nothing better than putting people in the position.
Well, let me tell you a little bit about that research. So the people who did the research on internal versus external, and I obviously can be wrong, but I've read a lot of this research, and I'm telling you, a lot of times what they do is they go, okay, let's take a group of, let's take a group of, I'll do my sport, let's say golfers, right? And I say my sport, I think I've done more baseball than golf in the last 2 years, but let's say we take golfers and we say, okay, this one group over here, they're going to hit balls, and we're going to give them knowledge of results. We're going to say, hey, on every shot, if it was too long, too short, left or right, that's an external cue, and you're going to practice. Every shot, it's like, oh, that was too long, go shorter, shorter. And then we're going to take this other group over here, and they're going to do internal focus. We're going to say, okay, you need to keep your right elbow in a better position. I'm just making something up, right? So the research, what they do is they give one group of people an internal cue, like keep your spine angle up or keep your elbow in. The other one, they give them external cues. And the research will say the ones who get the external cues always perform better. But here's the thing that and I know is the people in the group that were getting the internal cue, like let's say you take 100 people and say, keep your elbow in. How many of them needed to keep their elbow in, right? So
that's a great point.
So if they actually took expert coaches and went to each one of them and said, let's do an evaluation, and on each one of them, this is what you need to think of, and this is what you need to think of, I would put that up against external cues any day of the week. And there's definitely, our goal is internal cues, I think, help you get the feel of what you're trying to learn. And then once you have it, of course, we try and shift to external.
And one of the things that I actually talk about is, if we're going to dumb it down to the absolute most, I look at, external focus cues for performance, internal for where people want to feel it. And there's two studies. It was Sarman in 2009 with glute activation during hip extension, and Palmerud in 95, which did one on EMG of shoulder muscles without a change in position. And I think what we have to appreciate is there's also a difference between arthrokinematics and osteokinematics.
100%.
Right? And a lot of people don't necessarily appreciate what's actually happening at the joint level. They're thinking just in the context of, the big flexion extension, and they're not really talking about the rolling, the rocking, and the gliding that's taking place. So there's definitely a place for both. And I think it's good to hear you talk about it with your background, that you've been exposed to both. You use both in both random and blocked and internal and external. Do you think it's a big mistake that we see so many coaches who spend a lot of time with, it's almost like an over-reliance on still frame photos?
So let me give you, I always say, so like if we take data on somebody, let's say we take motion capture data, there's three ways to look at the data. Visual, so we can represent it, make it look like a video, look at pictures or snapshots. Number two is we can look at numbers, like snapshots in time, look at like how much are your hips rotated at the top of the wind up or whatever, right? Or we can look at the entire pitch or the entire hit. If you look at either the first two, pictures like snapshots or just data of snapshots in time, all you're getting is what's happening at that specific point in time, right? Like a great example of this is if I take, let's say I take the average MLB hitter and I say, how much do they rotate their hips at the end of the negative move when they've loaded, right? And if I take a look at the data and I go, okay, the average hitter somewhere between 20 and 40 degrees pelvic rotated. Okay, let's just say, I'm making something up right now, but it's pretty close. Let's say between 20 and 40 degrees rotated. And I look at your player and I go at the top of the negative move, or like when they're done, their hips are at 10 degrees. And I'm just looking at that one snapshot in time. Whether I show you a picture or data, most coaches would say, oh, that's not enough. You need to turn more, right? But all that's saying is that at that snapshot in time, their hips are only 10 degrees rotated. That doesn't mean that it wasn't 50 degrees earlier. In other words, they can over-rotate as they start to move, but when they get to the end of the weight shift, or the end of the load, it could be at 10 degrees. And if you don't know that it was 40 degrees a couple milliseconds before that, but at this snapshot in time, it's only 10 degrees, you can give them the worst information or worst advice ever. So I'm always nervous, like especially with data, like you said, photos, but data is potentially even worse. If you just look at numbers and you go, let me see what their hip rotation is at the top and their shoulder angles over here. And that is the worst way in the world to coach, because you really don't know what they were before. You need to see the progression of how they got there and what happens after they leave there. Does that make sense?
I think it's also, does it lead to a discussion of not just positions, but the forces acting on them, like the kinetics
100%.
versus kinematics discussion. Like we hear those terms thrown around. This is your world. Explain the important differentiation.
Okay. So the first thing is I like to call it the what, why, and how. Okay. So if you want to know what's happening, if you want to I want to know, did they move to the right? Did they move to the left? Did they go up and down? Did they rotate? That's either video or 3D motion capture. Kinematics, we call it. That's like putting sensors on somebody. Okay. If you look at kinematics or video, it tells me what's happening. And you can look in 6 different directions. Are you moving front to back, left to right, up and down? You can see if they're rotating, side bending, or forward bending, right? So it kind of tells me orientation and location, where I am. That's what. If you want to know what somebody's doing, if you want to know if they're swaying, or if they're losing space, or if they're casting their hands, that's a video camera or 3D motion capture for kinematics. Now, if you want to know why they're doing that, that's a whole different conversation. So why somebody's doing it, it could be a physical problem, right? So physical screening helps answer some of the whys, right? There could be an equipment problem. They could be doing something because the equipment doesn't fit them properly. And then there's the really important one too is, well, how are they doing it, right? So if I want to know what you're doing, if I want to know if you're shifting weight to the right, I look at a video camera or 3D motion capture. If I want to know how you're shifting to the right, that's kinetics or force and pressure. That's when we look at the ground to see how they're using ground reaction forces, because I can have 3 players that move 3 inches to the right, and all 3 of them can do it in a totally different way. One of the biggest problems with the whole data movement, right, is understanding how to interpret this data. And a lot of times it's because we don't have the right data in front of us, so we're trying to make stuff up. You know what I mean?
Yeah.
I mean, let me say two, this might be totally off topic, but I feel like baseball has done something crazy backwards in the data world. And I say this in my talks all the time, is that we go to tons of federations, like Olympic federations. And if let's say the Chinese, let's say table tennis Olympic Federation calls me and says, hey, Greg, I want you to come help me, right? If I walk into that federation, I know for sure when I walk in there, the coaches are going to sit me down and they're going to go, all right, this is what we think we need to measure. We want to know, can you give us paddle speed and elbow velocity? The coaches are going to say, here's what's important, and can you give me this? Us data nerds will go, let's go look and see what technology we have to measure this. And we'll come back to them and say, okay, you asked for 10 things, coaches. Here's the 9 things we can give you. And the coaches are like, this is great. And they use this to make their, like you said, their diagnosis or the recommendation. In baseball, I think the world heard that data was important. And what they did is they went and got a lot of data guys, and I'm sure you've seen this a million times. And they got these data guys, they brought them in, and what did they do? They went to the data guys and they said, what should we measure? Well, the data guys were like, what do you mean? Aren't you supposed to tell me what you're supposed to measure? So the data guys aren't even baseball guys, and they're going, well, I think this is important. You should look at hip rotation at the top of the negative move, or and they give this information to the coaches, and now the coaches are like, oh, this must be important because the data guy asked for this. It's completely backwards, right? I feel like there's so much data that we're looking at right now that nobody knows how to interpret it because it didn't start with common sense.
Thank you for sticking with me as we counted down our top 10 episodes of 2020. For more information and to find the full versions of each of these episodes, please just refer to the show notes and you'll find the links provided. 2020 was a year of growth for us here at the podcast, and it's because of each of you that we were able to see 400,000 downloads this year. I wanted to personally thank each and every one of you for your support, and we hope to bring you even more great content in 2021. Thanks again for listening along, and we'll talk to you soon.
Thank you for joining us for another episode of the CSP Elite Baseball Development Podcast. If you enjoyed this episode, we'd be thrilled if you'd consider subscribing to the podcast and leaving us a review to read on iTunes. We welcome your suggestions for future guests and questions. Just email elitebaseballpodcast@gmail.com. Thank you for your continued support, and we'll see you next episode.